Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Global University. Another happy day. Happy because we have with us David Hoffman, who's familiar to many of us and to many of the people up on the screen. David is he's at Ohio State University, a professor of history. He handles the Soviet period with a good group of people who have been training cohorts of graduate students who've been taking up positions as well, and that's a lot of work. He's a graduate of Columbia University. I know because I was there. And so is Fran Bernstein, who was in the room, Fred Corney, who's on the screen, part of a long group of people who then took up positions in various places. Now, aside from all that, David's been very busy writing books, more than most of us, I think. I think you have 4 monographs now, is that right?
Yeah.
And you tend to focus on the more recent ones, which is to say, Cultivating the Masses, which is about, well, it's superficially about Stalinist society and even pre-Stalinist society as well, but it's more focused on the modern techniques of government that are to be found anywhere and how they deployed in particular ways in the case of Stalinist Russia or the Soviet Union. Would that be a good characterization
Yes.
of the book? And therefore a book well worth reading. It's not narrowly Soviet. I mean, it's about the Soviet Union, but tapping into what all states do in the modern period, beginning in the 20th century. And the other one is an overview of Stalinism itself, another book which tries to bring together all of the different elements we associate with Stalinism. Again, talking about modern states at the same time. And since then, David, because he hasn't had enough to do, has been writing another book. He's been researching it right now. And this book is about, well, he's going to tell you in just a minute, but it's about memory. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, no, moving your camera.
Oh, right. Oh, I see. Oh, I see.
It just,
Right.
it won't respond to something like that.
So, yeah, modern state practices. We're being, yeah. And he's been writing about memory, and it's memory of World War II. So it's a study in memory, which of which we have some good examples already in historiography. But it's also a study in a particular kind of memory, which is the central place of the experience of the Great Fatherland War in not only the Russian and the Soviet and Russian experience, but also in the former Soviet experience more generally. And he's at the early stages, I think, of the research. You mind if I share with him the good news that you've had recently? And so he was just given a Guggenheim Prize in order to conduct his research. Now, this is a big thing, right? This is when the president finds out who you are of the university, which I think has just happened, right? And so we should all congratulate him. He'll be on leave, he'll be doing the bulk of his research. Well, it's with all of us, and we might want to talk about this. You know, how do we conduct research when it's very unlikely we're going to go to the Soviet Union, to the former Soviet Union, or at least to Russia itself, in current circumstances? We're all dealing with this, obviously, in different ways. So I give the floor to David. Welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Yanni. It's a real pleasure to be here at NYU. When I started working on World War II memory a few years ago, I had no idea how relevant the topic would become. Its relevance, of course, due to the fact that Putin tries to use war memory to build support for his current war in Ukraine. So what I'd like to do today is to discuss World War II commemoration, both in the Soviet Union and in contemporary Russia, including looking at how the Putin government has used World War II memory for propaganda purposes. On May 7th, 2000, Vladimir Putin was inaugurated as Russia's new president. He was 47 years old. 2 days later, as pictured here, he addressed a massive military parade on Red Square, marking the 55th anniversary of the victory in World War II. He said this, quote, "Glory to the soldiers. They have passed on to us a heroic tradition and have willed that we should celebrate this victory as our own. The years may pass, but the memory of the great patriotic war will remain just as great a lesson for all of us." For the next 23 years, right up to the present, Putin has marked the anniversaries of every major battle of the war. He's presided over Victory Day parades. He's met with veterans. He's visited monuments. He's even tried to stress his own personal connections to the war. Now, this is something of a stretch because he was born in 1952, 7 years after the war ended. But he's highlighted the fact that his father fought in the war and that his elder brother died as an infant during the siege of Leningrad. So in every possible way, Putin has tried to connect himself to the memory of World War II and to present himself as the protector of that memory, simultaneously making war commemoration a pillar of Russian national identity. So why is this? Why has the Putin government put such enormous emphasis on the memory of World War II? And why have these appeals resonated with the Russian population? To answer the first question, I'll talk about the political utility of war memory, that is how war memory can be used for political and mobilizational purposes. And on the second question, why these appeals resonate, I'll describe how a particular narrative of the war became deeply ingrained in the minds of Russian citizens. This will involve analyzing continuities between the Soviet and post-Soviet period. Because in many ways, war commemoration in Russia today draws on the rituals and narratives of the Soviet era. But there are also significant discontinuities. So in the second half of the talk, I will examine some of the differences between Soviet and post-Soviet war memory. So let me start with the political utility of war memory. Almost all studies of war commemoration show this. The memory of a war reflects not just the events of the past, but the political needs of the present. And in the case of post-Soviet Russia, World War II memory definitely filled a political need. The collapse of communism in 1991 left a large ideological void. Russia in the 1990s suffered not only economic decline, but something of a national identity crisis. So Russian leaders were looking for traditions that might unite the population, might inspire patriotism and pride. And here, the recent Tsarist past did not offer very much, particularly under Nicholas II. Russia had been weak and divided. What stood out as the greatest emblem of national strength was, and also of unity, was the victory in World War II. This is something that Putin and his government seized on. Putin, in a 2011 speech, even called World War II memory, quote, excellent cement to unite people into one indivisible Russian nation. World War II memory also served a need in the realm of international politics. The early 2000s were a moment when Russia had diminished international standing. So it was useful to recall the Second World War, a moment when the Soviet Union had played the leading role, defeating Nazi Germany, the time when the country had risen to become a superpower that would rival the United States for world domination. Also, with NATO expansion in 2004, as pictured on this map, Putin found it useful to recall a time when the country had defeated a Western aggressor. In other words, recalling a moment of military strength at a time of perceived increased military threat. World War II commemoration also allowed Russia to amplify its version of World War II. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania all increasingly condemned the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. In response, the Putin government emphasized its own periodization of the war, a periodization that essentially ignored the first 2 years of the war completely, and instead saw the war as beginning with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The Putin government also tried to use World War II memory to justify its invasion of Ukraine, trying to portray its invasion as a continuation of the struggles of World War II. This poster is from Crimea in 2014. After Russia seized Crimea, they held this referendum where Crimean citizens were supposed to vote whether to remain part of Ukraine or to join the Russian Federation. Ukraine portrayed here as a Nazi state. This is really Putin's most blatant use of World War II memory, and I'll come back to talk about it more later in the talk when I discuss Holocaust remembrance. But first, I want to address a more general question, and that is, why does World War II commemoration still hold meaning for the Russian population? It's now been 78 years since the end of World War II, there's almost nobody left alive in Russia who even remembers the war. In fact, they now have what they call the Immortal Regiment. It used to be that World War II veterans would march in Victory Day parades. There are very few of them left alive. Those still alive can no longer march. So in their place, they have these Russian citizens who hold portraits of their ancestors who did fight in the war. This was originally a grassroots movement. It's been co-opted by the Russian government. In fact, if you look here in the center of the picture, there's Putin holding a portrait of his father. So the vast majority of Russians today have no personal memory of the war, and yet it's clear that World War II commemoration still holds meaning for many of them. Victory Day is perhaps the most popular holiday in Russia today. And to understand the continued appeal of World War II memory, it's necessary to look back to the Soviet period. The Second World War in the post-war Soviet Union became the defining moment for the Soviet Union, surpassing even the October Revolution in terms of its importance. And accordingly, World War II memory became a focal point for Soviet society. Soviet commemorative culture on the war was pervasive in education and public life. For decades, people were immersed in World War II memory. This is illustrated well by one of the chapters in the volume that I edited on World War II memory in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. This particular chapter by Olga Konka. For this chapter, Konka examined Soviet school textbooks and primers from the 1940s all the way through the 1980s. And what she found was that very early on, a sort of master narrative of the war was established. And then it continued with very few changes, edition after edition, year after year, decade after decade. All of these textbooks had the same World War II periodization, the same stories, the same heroes. Also, these school children learn the names of Alexander Mitrosov and the Panfilovsi. Book learning was augmented by school museums, visits to monuments, and ceremonies to honor veterans. Here's a picture showing Soviet school children honoring World War II veterans in a ceremony. The speeches in these ceremonies all use the same phrases about ruthless invaders, heroism, unity, self-sacrifice, the same phrases that they use in Russia today when they're commemorating the Second World War. So the pervasiveness of this commemorative culture meant that it became deeply ingrained in the minds of many Russian citizens. And the result is that there are strong continuities between Soviet and post-Soviet World War II memory. Current Russian war memory draws extensively on Soviet myths, symbols, and rituals. The master narrative of the war is largely the same, minus the leading role of the Communist Party. The master narrative tells of a fascist invader that was vanquished by the people's unity and the Red Army's heroism. All suffering is attributed to the enemy, while negative aspects of the war are not mentioned. There's nothing about leadership failures, popular panic. There's nothing about repression, penal battalions, deportation of national minorities. Instead, it's a story of heroism and sacrifice that resulted in triumph, with popular unity as the key to the victory. So obviously, this is something that is useful for Putin to call on today as he tries to keep the Russian population unified behind his war in Ukraine. To illustrate the degree to which this official narrative permeated popular consciousness, I'll use the example of how it influenced even those who fought in the war themselves. Now, as I mentioned today, almost all veterans have passed, but in oral history interviews that were conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers found that, curiously, veterans could not recall much beyond the official history of the war. They seemingly had forgotten all of their own wartime experiences. Instead, they simply repeated platitudes about the Red Army's bravery and heroism. So we might ask, why were personal memories so influenced by official remembrance? This is an interesting dimension of memory studies, the relationship between individual and collective memory. Maurice Halbwachs, who in many ways was a founder of studies of collective memory, he posited that all memory is essentially social. In contrast to Sigmund Freud, Halbwachs argued that people's memories cannot be purely individual because they're always formed through communication with others. He thus saw people's memories as reflections of master narratives in their societies, and connecting with these narratives was a way for people to find meaning in their own lives and a way for them to form bonds with their communities. So for Halbwachs, individuals' memories cannot be separated from their societies or their cultures. Recent neurological research tends to support Halbwachs' ideas. The process by which information is stored in people's long-term memories requires physiological changes to neural networks, changes that require rehearsal and meaningful association. Repetition is crucial for the encoding of information into people's long-term memories. So in other words, this fundamentally associative nature of human memory means that people's own recollections are shaped by the narratives and stories that they have heard. So this was true for Soviet veterans. For those who came after, for later generations, it was even more the case because they didn't have any information with which to contradict, the official history of the war. The Soviet government had monopolized all ideological resources. It presented one account of the war. Censorship prevented any alternative accounts from circulating. The same is almost true in Russia today. There's a 2014 law that prohibits, quote, dissemination of false information about the Soviet Union during the Second World War. So the official story of the war as this moment of national unity has been the dominant narrative for decades, and it continues to resonate with many Russian citizens. Okay, let me now shift to look at some of the discontinuities between Soviet and post-Soviet World War II memory. During Soviet times, the war was remembered as a pan-Soviet victory, not an exclusively Russian victory. All the nationalities, including Ukrainians, were given credit for the victory in World War II. There was even talk of a brotherhood of nationalities that had defeated the German fascists. That is no longer true in the post-Soviet era. In Russia, the war is seen as Russia's victory alone. Putin even stated that Russia deserves sole credit for winning the war, stating, quote, "We are the country of victors." Connected with this is another discontinuity, and that has to do with the prominent place of the Russian Orthodox Church in World War II memorialization. This, of course, was not the case during the Soviet era, when the church was largely prohibited from operating and organized religion was persecuted. But in post-Soviet Russia, the Orthodox Church has assumed a prominent place. In fact, it's clear that Putin sees the church as an instrument of state power. And so the church has played an important role in government commemorations, including for World War II. This is a picture of the fairly recently opened Cathedral of Russian Armed Forces. Here it is in 2020, being consecrated by Patriarch Kirill, the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is an enormous cathedral. It contains murals with battlefield scenes from World War II. The floor of the cathedral is made of metal from melted down Nazi tanks and artillery. Even beyond this cathedral, the Russian Orthodox Church is often involved in ceremonies commemorating World War II. Another area of difference between Soviet and post-Soviet memory has to do with the representations of gender in World War II memorials. During the war, a large number of women enlisted in the Soviet military. There were some 800,000 women in the Red Army, including 120,000 combat troops. So one would have expected that after the war, these female veterans would get some sort of acknowledgement. Instead, they were almost entirely forgotten in the post-war Soviet Union. Soviet war memorials depicted soldiers exclusively as men. There are no statues of women soldiers in Soviet war monuments. Now, there are female figures. For example, this is the central statue at the Battle of Stalingrad Memorial. It's this enormous figure of Mother Russia at the time. It was unveiled in 1967. It was the largest statue in the world. But this is an allegorical figure. This does not represent women actually fighting in the Red Army during the war. There are the other female figures in this and other war monuments picture women in traditionally feminine roles. So we might ask, why is it that female figures were largely forgotten after the war? War for any society marks a rift, a disruption in normal societal function due to mobilization and loss. This is especially true in the Soviet Union, given the enormous scale of death and destruction. And the way a war is remembered often serves to try to repair that rift, to reestablish pre-war social norms. In the case of the Soviet Union, to try to reestablish the pre-war gender order, which had been disrupted by the war. Of the 27 million Soviets killed in the war, 20.5 million were men. So after the war, women greatly outnumbered men, especially in this age 20 to 40 cohort. Even of male veterans who survived, many were disabled. This is the topic that Fran Bernstein is finishing a book on. Given the fact that there were so many men missing and disabled, all of this created the potential for a crisis of masculinity after the war. But the way the war was remembered, Soviet official culture sought to sort of buttress male authority and to prevent that crisis of masculinity from happening. So the way that men were portrayed, this is actually the second largest statue at the Battle of Stalingrad Memorial. It shows a male soldier, bare-chested and muscular, has a machine gun in one hand, grenade in the other. By portraying men as strong, heroic, courageous, this was a way to try to buttress masculinity after the war. Meanwhile, women were presented, as I said, in traditional female roles. This is also Battle of Stalingrad Memorial. It shows a grieving mother, a mother mourning her fallen son. Memorialization always involves not only remembering, but also forgetting. One of the things forgotten was the role of female soldiers in World War II combat. And this, of course, had real consequences in that it reinforced traditional gender roles in post-war Soviet society. This opportunity to present women as comrades in arms, an effort to try to increase women's equality, this opportunity was lost. Instead, as I said, women were presented as in traditional roles as mothers, as victims, or sometimes as nurses or combat medics. Interestingly, this has changed in the post-Soviet period. In Russia today, the role of women in fighting in World War II is being remembered. This is a picture from the 2012 Russian television series Night Swallows. It's based on a true story of a squadron of female bomber pilots during World War II. So 7 decades after the war, female combatants finally being acknowledged. Of course, most of them are no longer alive. But this was also true with this 2015 film, The Battle for Sevastopol. This was a major film sponsored by the Russian Ministry of Culture in 2015. It was headed by Vladimir Medinsky, one of Putin's right-hand men, who was charged with making more World War II patriotic films. So this was one of them. Pavlichenko was a sniper in the Red Army. She had over 300 confirmed kills during the war. In the post-war Soviet Union, female soldiers had to leave military service. Today, Russian women can join the military, though not in combat roles. They make up about 10% of the Russian armed forces. So the memory of female soldiers in World War II provides something of a role model for them. Okay, let me finally turn to Holocaust remembrance, because here too we see a major difference between Soviet and post-Soviet war memory. In the Soviet period, the Holocaust was entirely left out of World War II memory. Soviet officials did not recognize Jewish suffering as distinct. They did not want the Holocaust to somehow overshadow the suffering of the Soviet people as a whole. So any mention of Holocaust massacres was simply referred to as the murder of civilians without acknowledging that these victims were Jewish. This is a picture of the monument at Babin Yar, the ravine outside Kiev, where in the fall of 1941, tens of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were machine gunned to death by Nazi SS troops. For decades, there was no monument here at all. Finally, one was erected in 1976, but at the time, it made no mention of the fact that the victims here were Jewish. Interestingly, under the Putin government, the Holocaust has now become an important part of World War II memory. This is a picture of a poster of the 2018 film Sobibor. The film tells the true story of a Jewish Red Army soldier, Alexander Petrovsky, who led a successful revolt at this Nazi death camp, killing guards and escaping along with a number of other inmates. So why has the Putin government made Holocaust remembrance an important part of World War II memory? This is a question addressed by another chapter in the book I edited, this chapter by Anton Weisbent. Weisbent points out that Putin first mentioned the Holocaust in 2003 during a visit of then Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon. Putin subsequently went to Israel in 2005. He visited Yad Vashem. He gave a speech on the Holocaust. So initially, acknowledgement of the Holocaust was to improve relations with Israel. But very quickly, the Putin government started to use Holocaust remembrance in other ways as well. In 2004 already, the Russian Foreign Ministry invoked the Holocaust to condemn Nazi collaborators in Latvia. So criticizing Latvia and other Baltic countries by referring to the Holocaust. In fact, the Russian delegation to the UN even sponsored resolutions condemning Latvian fascists for collaborating in the Holocaust. And then with the 2014 Russian seizure of Crimea and intervention in Donbass, the Russian government began to focus on the Holocaust in Ukraine. At the time, Putin explicitly referred to World War II history, this at the time meaning 2014. Putin condemned Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera for collaborating with the Nazis. He began to speak of neo-Nazis in contemporary Ukraine. And ultimately, this rhetoric provided his justification for launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In his speech, February 21st, 2022, this just on the eve of the Russian invasion, Putin said that the invasion was necessary to protect ethnic Russians from neo-Nazis. He said that Ukrainian neo-Nazis will, quote, kill innocent people just as members of the punitive units of the Ukrainian nationalists and Hitler's accomplices did during the Great Patriotic War. He went on to say that the purpose of the Russian invasion was to prevent genocide and to, quote, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Well, it seems strange that a country with a Jewish president would be accused of being led by neo-Nazis, especially because in the case of Zelensky, some of his ancestors were killed in the Holocaust. His grandfather actually fought in the Red Army against the Nazis. So this would lead us to ask, how effective are these Russian attempts to try to use World War II memory and Holocaust memory in order to build support for the current war in Ukraine. Well, it's very difficult to judge, public opinion in Russia today. We don't have any public opinion polling. There's no freedom of speech. Anybody who opposes the war, if they speak out against it, they could be arrested, sent to prison for 15 years. There have been some of these rallies to try to show their support for the war, but these are obviously government-sponsored rallies. They're not a reflection of genuine popular sentiment. We do have other evidence indicating a lack of popular support for the war. This is the scene at Russia's border with Georgia this past September, where thousands of Russian young men were fleeing the country to avoid being conscripted and sent to go fight in Ukraine. I think the problem with using World War II memory is not that it lacks meaning for the Russian population. I think it does have meaning for many Russian people. The problem is that World War II is a very poor analog for Russia's current war in Ukraine. Not only does this attempt to portray Ukrainian leaders as neo-Nazis seem kind of ridiculous, World War II was always portrayed as a defensive war. And the war in Ukraine is so clearly a war of aggression that it's very difficult to recast it as some sort of defense of Russia, even though, of course, that's what Putin is trying to do. Okay, let me conclude just by juxtaposing these two images. On the left, we see Putin laying flowers at a cemetery in St. Petersburg, where victims of the siege of Leningrad are buried. On the right, we see victims of the siege of Mariupol, Ukrainian civilians who've been under Russian artillery bombardment. World War II in the Soviet Union was an event of enormous trauma and loss. It was also a military victory of historic importance. So it's not surprising that World War II is still commemorated in Russia today. But that does not dictate how the war is remembered, or the fact that even now, 78 years after the war has ended, that it's still seen as a pillar of Russian national identity. Putin has emphasized World War II because it's politically useful to recall this moment of Russian military glory, useful to try to build patriotism. Putin has also used Holocaust memory for political purposes, especially focusing on Nazi collaborators and alleged neo-Nazis in Ukraine today, using this fiction to try to justify his invasion of Ukraine. But the effectiveness of World War II memory may be limited when it comes to mobilizing popular support for the war in Ukraine. It's very difficult to portray a war of aggression as a defensive effort. And both in the Soviet era and in Russia today, World War II is always remembered as a defense of the motherland. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. So to remind you about procedures, we have people in the room who can ask questions. We have people on Zoom who can ask questions. You can ask questions either by writing on the chat, and I'll see it, or by raising your hand, and you can speak your questions or comments as you wish. We have one here already. This comes from Eric. Eric, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name. As a child of a U.S. veteran, while I have no personal memories, my father talked of his experiences extensively. Did this not happen in the Soviet Union? That would seem surprising.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I unfortunately have not researched that. I assume that it did. I assume that veterans did tell stories to their families. I think the problem is that over time, even the veterans themselves, as I mentioned, they began to sort of have their personal memories displaced by these official memories and official narratives about the war. And this, of course, is not unique to the Soviet Union or World War II veterans. There have been studies that have shown that Vietnam veterans in the United States have memories of the war that are shaped entirely by Hollywood movies that they have seen. If they've seen, representations, that will over time, especially if you see repeated representations in a certain way, that will actually influence people's personal memories. So it's just an interesting dynamic of individual memory and collective memory.
The series of films about Vietnam, if you remember when that whole series of films were coming out, there was Platoon, there was Full Metal Jacket, and veterans coming forward and saying, no, this is a better representation, no, that's a better representation. And in fact, what they would do was comparing themselves to a movie, right?
Right.
We have a question from the outside from Alexei Kotelvas. Can we unmute Alexei? Alexei, you can go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the interesting presentation. We have a tendency to talk about commemoration of World War II in post-Soviet Russia in the context of political utility, but is there any traces of alternative narratives distancing from the official point of view, or it looks like society just gave this topic to the state for ages? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. So there actually, in the 1990s, there actually were efforts to try to recall the war, and at the time there were still some veterans alive, efforts to recall, more genuine accounts of the war and what it was like. And then, in addition, historians have really worked on this. Up until 2014, there were some major projects conducted by historians in Moscow and elsewhere in Russia, trying to get more scholarly, more balanced account of the war, going beyond all these official narratives about self-sacrifice and glory, actually examining things like penal battalions, other negative aspects of the war, the enormous casualties, asking questions about, was this in fact a victory at all, or a Pyrrhic victory perhaps, if anything. So there are both, I think, on a popular level and scholarly level, there were efforts to go beyond this sort of official master narrative of the war. And unfortunately, that has been entirely eliminated since 2014. These new laws about making it illegal actually to essentially say anything negative about World War II or the Soviet military. This has prevented that sort of exploration from going forward, and it's very unfortunate. But today, it's really at least publicly impossible to make that sort of inquiry in Russia.
May I ask a question about that? I would what archives now to scholars? Are they open or they closed?
Yeah, right. So I really do not know the answer to that. I do have some friends in Moscow who were working on this before, and I think they probably no longer are able to work on it.
They were closed.
The archives are closed on World War II. Yeah. Okay. So that too prevents that sort of genuine exploration.
But to be fair, Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation did a great job by putting a lot of stuff about individual people who took part in the World War II. For instance, I found a lot of stuff about my dad there. So they did put it on the web. You can find this, and there's a very good search. They don't allow you to see the original document, but they put original documents as well. The big majority of documents of their archives have been reclassified.
Okay, right. Thank you.
We have a written question, and then we'll get to another two more oral questions. This is from Anne Babrov Hajal. Given the Russian government's control over most Russian media, to what degree is Putin able to convince people that this is a defensive war, whether against fascists, quote unquote, or NATO getting closer to Russia's borders?
Yes. So I'm glad to have that question. One of the things that really has struck me over the past year, this initially, Putin was trying to sell this as a continuation of the struggles of World War II. We're going to fight the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. You actually hear less and less of that as time goes on. increasingly, this is portrayed as Russia versus NATO and the United States.
As opposed to Nazis.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I think in that sense, maybe he is able to sell it as a defensive war, not against neo-Nazis, not even that much against Ukrainians. It's against NATO, the United States, the entire West is against Russia. They're trying to crush Russia. That is, I think, what we see in terms of Russian propaganda. That has become, I think, the dominant theme, even displacing this idea of neo-Nazis and trying to eliminate them from Ukraine.
We have an oral question from Alex Yachatkin. No, I'm sorry, Donna Orwin. Can we unmute Donna Orwin?
Hello, everybody. I'm an outsider. I don't think I know any of the any of the people here, but I'm a Tolstoy scholar, David. And I do study, because of my work on Tolstoy, I do study the issue of war and Russian culture. And one of the great discoveries by Tolstoy was that that veterans can't describe war. He was himself a participant in the Crimean War, and he wrote 3 stories about the Crimean War. And one of the points he wanted to make was that people make up stories because they do not know what has happened to them. So I just wanted to add that to you, and that's especially a product of modern warfare, starting with artillery, cross shooting of artillery and so on. People just do not have a clue. So this is a big theme in War and Peace, and it's something that has been adopted by, I believe, every war writer since Tolstoy. So I just want to add that in addition to neurological studies and so on as to why people accept other stories or easily lose their own stories, it's because they really don't know what has happened.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It was a little too much for me to expect World War II veterans to have a perfect recollection of their own experiences. Because, as you say, what Tolstoy pointed out, other scholars since then have studied this phenomenon as well. It's just in some cases impossible for veterans to describe and then even recall for themselves what it was like in combat. Things just so horrific that are happening, so much different or beyond comprehension, because it's different from everyday life, different from what they've experienced. They don't necessarily have, even the vocabulary to try to articulate it or conceptualize it. So that definitely plays a role too. When I mentioned these World War II veterans not recalling what it was really like during the war, it's true. It's not just that they've heard the master narrative over and over. It's that they had a hard time actually conceptualizing based on their own experiences and trying to articulate that.
We have another oral question from Joseph Bradley.
David, good to see you. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I particularly liked the way you set up the continuities and discontinuities in the memory of the war. But I would encourage you to try to pinpoint when World War II became the predominant memory moment, because of course for a long time it was the revolution. But then at some point it wasn't the revolution anymore. The Polish historian Bartłomiej Gajos in Warsaw pinpoints to the late 1960s, shortly after the 50th anniversary of the revolution and the beginning of Brezhnev's rule, that's when World War II became the predominant memory moment. It may be another time, I'm not sure. Your research could bring this out. I remember being in Moscow on the exchange in the 1970s. It was already pretty clear that World War II was the dominant memory. That the memory such as it was of 1917 was really fading, and it was very much a kind of official celebration. And World War II became more of an important one. And this also, the 70s was the time, this connects, I think, with something you were saying, was a time when Russian not so much nationalism, but sort of self-consciousness of Russian identity began to be more acceptable. I think of the village school of writers, discovering old Russian churches and so on, restoring icons. It's also a time, I think, when the war itself really sort of caught on, not so much caught on, but became this a much more important national celebration. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so I sort of, for the purposes of the talk, oversimplified a little, saying Soviet versus post-Soviet World War II memory. But if you look at within the Soviet period, war memory does change, of course, over time. In the post-war Stalin years, there were not many efforts to memorialize the war beyond, Stalin was a great leader who led us through the war. Then it changes under Khrushchev, when there's a much more of an effort to look at this as a people's war, there's this whole new genre of literature, trench warfare, trying to describe what it was like for soldiers in the trenches and so forth. And then, the Brezhnev era. And I think that is probably when it really, World War II really does emerge as the centerpiece for legitimacy for the Soviet regime, even surpassing the revolution in terms of importance. Sometimes scholars will point to 1965. That was the year when Brezhnev made Victory Day a national holiday, a non-working holiday once again. Before that, Victory Day was celebrated, but people still had to work. It became a non-working holiday once again in 1965. And you just see this enormous cult of World War II, develop under Brezhnev. That's when so many of the enormous memorial complexes are completed. Just enormous amount of propaganda, publications about the history of the war. Of course, it's partly because Brezhnev himself was a political commissar in the Red Army during the war, so it was a way for him and his generation to sort of, legitimize their own rule, even beyond that of the Soviet state.
But it's also sort of leaving behind class struggle and embracing national unity, right?
Right. Yeah. If you look at, this goes back to my earlier research on the 1930s. You definitely see a shift once the Stalin declares that the bases of socialism have been built at the 17th Party Congress in 1934. No longer is there a class enemy, because kulaks and netmen have been eliminated. They've been dispossessed, many deported. And that's actually why they write a new constitution in 1936. There is a de-emphasis of class, and there seems to be a basis of national unity. Of course, then Stalin and the fellow leaders, they see that there actually is still dissent within the country. They get alarmed about that with the approaching war. It sets off purges, national operations, mass operations, enormous state violence. But yeah, then in the post-war period, there's this sense that the people all came together. There's much more talk about the Soviet people as one. They're no longer a number of different classes or groups. It's all a united people.
Or they're there, but they don't struggle somehow, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Donna Irwin was saying she had the same experience about the 1970s. Now we have another question here, which I'll read to you. This is from Alex Pachenkin. Hello, my name is Alex. I am a student at NYU Shanghai. There's such a thing, right? I've got a question about the place of the collective memory of World War II in contemporary, maybe even after February 2022, Russian literature, right? So the place of collective memory of World War II in Russian literature, right? And I think there's a sub-question, does this change after February 22? Do you know anything about this? How do the Russian authors, both who live in Russia and the ones who were forced to move abroad, remember the Second World War? Meaning, outside the official, I think is what Alex is asking.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, unfortunately, I have not studied that. Another chapter in that book I edited, this one by Angela Brentler, she actually looked at writers in the 1990s And there, some of them, after the end of the Soviet Union, they began to sort of re-examine their memories of the war. These were veterans. These were veterans who were still alive in the 1990s, and to question some of those sort of master narratives and to point out some of the negative aspects of the war. But I have not studied recent authors, so I really can't speak to that. I think Fran had a question.
Fran Bernstein, in the room.
So I'm wondering if you can pinpoint the moment when victory over fascism becomes victory over Nazism. Because when I went to Babi Yar, before the collapse, not only did it not say anything about Jews, but it said to all the victims of fascism.
Right.
And so at what point does Putin start using Nazism as opposed to fascism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I've never seen any proof of this, but I think the Soviets did not want to use Nazism because it was National Socialism. They thought that might confuse people because it might seem like some form of socialism. So they always called them fascist or fascism.
Right.
And I think it's only under Putin, partly because he's trying to play to a Western audience. And because we had always condemned Nazis and the Holocaust, he got the idea to speak about Nazism and neo-Nazis, that would somehow win support for Western audiences. I mean, not that it actually worked, but I think that I've never seen previous leaders. I never saw Yeltsin or anybody use that term either. I think it's really only under Putin they start talking about Nazis as opposed to fascists.
We're questioning this from earlier from Mark Silber. How widely known are Soviet KGB, transgression in World War II, specifically the Katyn and other massacres? So to what extent are they known today that these massacres are taking place?
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, so of course, for the longest time in the Soviet period, that was completely covered up. Only came to light during the Gorbachev years. So presumably, Russian citizens in the 1990s heard about Katyn and so forth, knew about those things. Though, as far as I know, they stopped talking about that today. I mean, I'm not sure there's any discussion.
It came up just recently.
Really?
I think it was an official channel. Claiming that Katyn was actually done by the Germans again.
Oh, okay. So now they switched back.
No, it's not true.
Of course, it's not true.
No, it's not true. So there was RIA Novosti, the official website, published an article claiming that Polish officers killed in Katyn along with others were killed by Nazis.
Yes.
Putin made a statement. Putin came out with a statement, and it was released by Kremlin as saying that this is not true, that it was NKVD who killed Polish officers. It wasn't just Katyn, as you well aware, it was in Tver and Ryazan, in 3 places at least. So, no.
When was this? But this is
Right after RIA Novosti came out with this, there was, outrage all around, and Putin, Kremlin came out with a statement on that.
When, I'm asking when?
2 months ago, 1 month ago, something like that.
Recently.
It was just a recent.
Okay.
And in fact, it was Putin, it was first, Putin, first Gorbachev, then Yeltsin, and then Putin acknowledged the fact that NKVD killed this 10,000 plus Polish officers and soldiers in Katyn and other places.
Thank you. I have another question for you, but it's a nerdy one. We have no more from the audience, right?
Oh, I think Anne.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to register myself. You're in line first, but I just want to.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just, I had a couple questions. I mean, so many questions. But in particular, I wanted to ask, I'm really struck by the dissonance that you're describing between a number of them, between the what is known, what people have experienced. And you suggested there's memory studies that make it difficult for veterans to recall, but that's not necessarily the case for civilians, is it? I'm curious about that. I'm just thinking about the line or Jan Gross's setup to neighbors when he describes walking through Yadvabny and speaking with children who, when pressed, could tell you like something bad happened there, but it wasn't clear what. And you know, there was still a lot of mystery surrounding it, but that there was this kind of collective recollection of this event. And how it is that you get this evacuation of personal experience, and then you're describing at the same time this idea of the war that isn't even really the war, it seems, because it's not grounded in this history and it's being filled up with this content from other sources. And in particular around the Holocaust, I'm curious what those sources are. Like you were, I mean, just the talk of Hollywood has kind of gotten me thinking too, like, are they drawing from the lived experiences of people who went through this in creating Russia's, you know, reintegration of the Holocaust and memorialization, or is it? Do you have any sense, like in that film, like where it's coming from?
Right. Yeah. So first on the civilians, so I would assume, now I haven't seen any studies of this, but I would assume that they would not face the same obstacles as veterans because they would not be in these horrific combat situations, and they might just see, you know, an isolated atrocity here or there, which would be difficult to comprehend, but maybe more comprehensible and more recollectable. Yeah, the problem is I don't have a study, you know, we have these studies of interviews of World War II veterans, and I don't have comparable interview studies to then compare with for civilians who maybe witnessed some sort of massacre or atrocity or whatever, to see if they actually might have a better recollection or a clearer memory of the things that they saw or experienced. And in terms of the, you know, Holocaust memories, it's kind of tricky because since the Soviet Union did not acknowledge it for all those decades, it's like that would have been the time to actually collect material and develop a whole history of this. So when the Putin government tries to use Holocaust memory, my impression is that it's a very superficial kind of memory. It's not based in research, or it's not documented. It's not based on you know, eyewitness accounts or memoirs or anything like that. I think it's just, you know, Nazis are bad, and they had collaborators in Ukraine and the Baltic countries, and now they're neo-Nazis and they're going to do the same thing. So it's just kind of drawing on this general awareness of the Holocaust, not really, you know, based on any sort of empirical research or any sort of depth at all. I think it's more almost a symbol.
So the part two then is, given that that's the case, one of the things you said that really struck me is that, you know, one of the questions guiding this is why does World War II in summary hold so much meaning for the population? It just strikes me that there's a real disconnect here between like the idea of meaning and the vacuousness of what you're describing. And I'm wondering, if, you know, there's the obvious answer like, oh, well, so many people died and still they can hold these things. So this is a touchstone. But like, what are your, I know it's hard to say before you've done your research necessarily, but what are your senses of that?
Yeah, you know, I think, and this, I know the Soviet period better, but I think one of the things that is very striking about Soviet remembrance of World War II is that it never actually glorified war. I mean, it was a glorious victory, but the war itself, they never denied the fact that, you know, millions of people died. If you go to the Battle of Stalingrad Memorial, they have hundreds of thousands of names there of soldiers who died. The way they kind of got around the horror of all this is by referring to these people as fallen heroes. Fallen heroes that acknowledged the death, acknowledged the loss, but they were also heroes. They were heroic, they defended the country and were victorious. But, you know, memorials, they actually do, to have a real resonance with people, they do need to address trauma and grief. And Soviet war memorials do that. I mean, it may be in a highly gendered way, like I showed, the picture of the mother in mourning, mourning her fallen son and so forth. But it's not, it's not glorifying war. They did actually, serve as sites for mourning. They served as kind of, monuments to the great victory, but they were also sites of mourning for Soviet citizens. So I think in that way, at least during the Soviet period, war commemoration did have meaning for people. And then somehow it's, just because it's of what I mentioned, the history, the ceremonies, victory parades, just so pervasive for so long, it has continued, to have meaning for people, even if they don't have necessarily a very complex understanding of the war, especially the negative aspects of the war.
So as I said, a nerdy question, right? So I'll put before you two possibilities, there are many more, but two possibilities of how one can deal with memory, right? And ultimately about truth, right? The one model would be a book by Fred Corney, who is with us yet. And that's a book about memory. You're well familiar with it. And that's about how the memory of the October Revolution was in sort of everything that was said was probably true, right, in these narrations of what happened in the October Revolution. But inducing people to remember it in certain ways with certain inflections and to insert themselves in a narrative meant that they were being transformed into something which can be a part of a larger story, right? Part of close to what you're talking about with the collective memory, right? But part of what Corney was talking about is that this is also a participatory mass process in which people are induced to come and retell their stories in order to give it significance. I was there, yes, I remember, with inducements to emphasize certain things and other things less so, right? What did you do on that morning of October 25th? I got up in the morning, it was cold again, I went out to find some milk, I couldn't find any, blah, blah, right? So, okay, that's fine, but what happened in the afternoon is, oh, yes, I remember now, and that also happened. I stormed the Winter Palace, right? Okay, I walked through the side door, but anyway, right? You know what I'm saying? So that, you can't say that's untrue, but the question is how you narrate it and what narrative is a part of, right? So that's one view of memory. So I look at your war veterans or the Vietnam veterans or any of these people. So it's not that they're remembering wrongly, and they're not that they're making things up, but that they're induced to see themselves the way they see themselves in movies, right? Or in books or in master narratives in newspapers or in stories, right? It's not wrong, but it's that inflection, right? Now, the counterexample would be Catherine Meredith's book, which is close to your subject matter. And you remember the book he came out with, it's called Ivan's War.
Right.
And she had to confront this question of memory as well. And her response was that as a historian, she said, I'm the adjudicator of truth also. And I know that certain things said did not happen, or they're hiding things that did happen. The rapes, the mass murders, the random shootings of civilians, the shootings of prisoners, the way that they were mistreated by their own command, the way that they're thrown in as cannon fodder. So you're saying these things happened, and it's a lie to deny it, right? So her job was to show that these things actually happened, right? And then when she was actually asked here about memory, she said, I have no time for memory studies because it's just confusing what should be a matter of the truth versus the non-truth, right? I wonder what you think about these approaches.
Yeah.
And don't tell me the truth lies in between.
Yeah. So for my own work, I'm actually closer to what Fred Corney did. I think it's really interesting to see how people's memories are shaped or channeled in certain ways. It's kind of what I was referring to with Hall blocks, that, if you can attach yourself to these larger narratives, it does give meaning to your experiences, meaning to your losses, perhaps in wartime, or meaning to your life if you participated in the October Revolution. It does help to build bonds with other people. If you just have all these kind of fragmentary individual memories that might not add up to anything so big, but I even think of the Factory History Project in the 1930s, where they did a very similar thing to what Fred found in, this East part, this history of the party during the October Revolution. They had people sit down and tell their life stories, and they had to tell it in a certain way. And the way they told it, it actually gave it greater meaning. It wasn't just, working this terrible factory job for years. They were building socialism. So in this case, it wasn't just like fighting and dying in terrible conditions. They were defending the motherland. They defeated the fascists. So I would not deny that is true, even if it's, a certain version of the story, even if it leaves out some things, for these people that did have meaning. We have to attach, some significance to that. We can't just say, it's a bunch of lies.
Yeah.
If it meant something to these people, if that was a way that they understood their lives and their participation in the war, then obviously it was meaningful. But it is interesting that the particular way the narrative is formed, and it can be, it can be reshaped over time, though. The interesting thing in the Soviet case is that it does not change that much. You have this big shift in the Khrushchev era where, it was all about Stalin, and suddenly de-Stalinization, and no longer was it his victory alone, it was all the Soviet people. But the basic outline of the story is the same, people united to defeat the fascists. And so that does preclude some other stories and national minorities that were deported at the end of the war, that they didn't really get included in the story. So, so I do think it's important to try to look at alternative points of view as well. But yeah, I would not deny the importance of, the way people understand their life experiences, even if it does mean that it's subsumed into this larger master narrative.
Part of it is that we're giving ourselves significance when we insert ourselves in that narrative, right? Because otherwise our lives are quite banal, right? Even the act of fighting is banal unless you insert it into some meaning, right? So questions we've had all the time, where were you on 9/11, right? I have to remind myself I wasn't in New York, right? Because I've seen the images so much.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm not because I wanted to lie and say, yes, I was in New York. It's that I forgot that I wasn't in New York.
Yeah, right.
Because I've seen the images so much, right?
Yeah, people can have false memories. And again, this is kind of based, you see the images, it's that when you're getting all these other things in addition to your own life experience, it can influence what you remember.
May I make a small announcement just because there is clearly interested audience. I'm a librarian at NYU, and we just accepted the collection of military memoirs. So it's partially processed. If you're interested, talk to me. I will show you that moment. And I would also want to make a comment how that I think it's this the war become part of like national mythology, and I think it is also sort of important not to discount this. I just received yesterday a song written by my university. He's not my friend, but we went to university together, and he wrote very romantic song about soldier going to war. Clearly, it's war going to Ukraine, but it is like if I have to stand up for my motherland, I will have to do it. Like, I'm in love, I'm going to get married, but I'm going to protect my motherland. And nobody questions the premise of this song. What motherland? Protect your motherland. But this is just part of the whole psyche, I think. And it's that's all I have.
The memoirs you have, the documents you have at the library now, are they from what period?
They were published in the late 50s, 60s, 70s.
About the Great Fatherland War.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting.
So you have reason to come back to New York, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, David. What other story could Putin tell that was uniting? Is there another way that Putin could approach this issue of what Russia is today, other than saying that it is that it is a product of World War II.
Yeah, so
Is there any other way of defining it?
yeah, I mean, certainly there are a lot of ways he could focus on Russian culture, Russian literature, but that would not mobilize people for war. So if he wants to, like, to talk about Russia as a military power and talk about military glory, then World War II is definitely his best example. Yeah, so it's unfortunate. It sort of gets back to what I was saying earlier, that it's the political purposes or mobilizational purposes behind it, which actually sort of determines what the focus is and how the war is portrayed. But yeah, this, Russia does not have to be known for its military glory. It could be known for any number of things. And it's unfortunate that Putin, because of his military aims, has emphasized World War II as a basis for patriotism and trying to build support for his current war.
Anyone else out there in the on Zoom?
Some questions in the chat.
Thank you, Sandra. Oh my, here we go. All right, so here's the quick one landing on. This is from Fred Pointy, who we were just speaking about. And he asks, here's a follow-up on something Yanni, that's me, Yanni said about different approaches to memory. I think it's especially relevant when we come to veterans' memories. Veterans' memories, and civilians for that matter, are articulated in a moment and re-articulated repeatedly through life, even in highly authoritarian societies. So far? They come to their experiences of war, as Heinz has said, with the war in the head already, e.g. the memories of World War I. So they articulate their current experiences and thus their memories with those pre-existing frameworks. In fact, the trauma of war in their earlier experience may well affect how they choose to articulate their experience of World War I. Sorry, my mic is not working on my computer.
Okay, I was a little confused at the end. Memory of World War I?
Yeah, so he's saying that the trauma of World War I already provides the template.
It's World War, it should be World War II. He
Well,
said
okay.
no below comment.
Okay,
Oh, okay, so that's different.
right.
The trauma of war in their earlier experience, I guess during World War II, may well affect how they choose to articulate their experiences of World War II. Is that right, Chad?
Probably it was just World War II for the second.
Oh, okay. World War I influences how they think of World War II.
Fred, is
Yeah.
that right? World War I affects how they understand World War II?
Yes, he said.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay,
okay.
yeah, right, yeah, so that's a good point. You have previous wars, you have World War I, you have Civil War as well. Those things can then influence how the war is interpreted. And then even beyond that, there were Soviet films in the 1930s. There's a film, If War Comes Tomorrow, 1938. And that shows, an invader coming, everybody is then brave and stoic, united, no panic. That actually gives a template for how then they conceptualize and remember the war when it actually does come. Because they've seen a sort of cinematic representation of what the war, this coming war is supposed to be, and then the war arrives, and it's nothing like the movie, of course, but there's a tendency to understand what happens in terms of the story that the movie told. So yeah, you definitely have like these pre-existing experiences or cultural representations that influence understandings of what happens later.
There's a comment here from Bjorn Ingolstead. Alexievich, he says, oral histories of both female soldiers and children in World War II. This is
Yes, Svetlana.
okay.
Alexievich.
Okay. Next, I think it's important to distinguish this, Kathleen Smith. I think it's important to distinguish between individuals' memories, which are influenced by other narratives, of course, and the presentation of what should be remembered by influencers, propagandists, and memory actors.
Yeah, so one thing I oversimplified a little bit, there is a difference between collective memory and official memory. So you can have collective memory that's based on communities or even family stories that that will influence individual memories, as well as official, official memory, which can also influence individuals' memories. But yeah, there is another layer there that I didn't really have time to get into. And that's what Hallbox is actually discussing. When he talks about collective memory, it's not just the official state memory. It can be other things as well, other narratives as well.
We have here Niklaus Wietzel. Do you have any indication of how the Soviet Union tried to use World War II memory in its effort to reach out to the decolonizing global South during the Cold War?
Oh, I don't actually. That's a good question, because obviously during the Cold War, reaching out to the global South was an important effort by the Soviet government. And they did use things like the treatment of nationalities within the Soviet Union, which was supposedly progressive and positive, to try to reach those people. But I've never seen anything on how they use World War II memory. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they did, but I just haven't seen that.
All right. Here's an interesting one from Donna again, Donna Orwin. What about Chechnya, which could be seen as a catalyst to the downfall of the Soviet regime, or for that matter, there's another war later on in Russian times, which could be seen as something could be remembered or not remembered, or in what way? But for that matter, Afghanistan, she asks.
Right. Yeah, I think Afghanistan's the one that contributes to the downfall of the Soviet regime. The Chechen War comes after. Yeah. So neither of those are examples of war that they want to remember, particularly today, right? Especially the Afghan War. So that's obviously more recent than World War II. That's not what Putin wants to recall. World War II is the victory, the great victory and so forth. So it's understandable why that is the focus instead of looking at Afghan War, Chechen War.
Okay, we have a comment here from Joseph Bradley. I'm a volunteer in the Oral History Project Capitals, being a formal institution at the Holocaust Museum in DC. There are plenty of interviews of Soviet survivors and witnesses, now living abroad, conducted in the early 2000s. Unfortunately, most of the interviewees were children during the war, and their memories are very hazy. So you're right, the window of more active memories for the 1940s and 1970s in the USSR was never opened.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's good to know about those sources. Holocaust.
All right. Well, good. Well, thank you all very much, both out there and in here, for coming. And David, thank you very much. It was, as you can see, it was a stimulating conversation, and it's nice to get this overview. Am I to understand that the way you presented are the main parts of what the book's going to look like as you see it right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to focus more on the Soviet period. But I couldn't resist talking about the Putin era.
Nor could anyone else, right? So, yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And wait, there's a comment. All right, that was a clapping from Joseph Brown.